If you want to understand the entire history of horror games, you need to understand the importance of one simple thing: familiarity. Horror always contains a bit of the unknown. Without this, it isn't horror. You can put a character in countless dangerous situations. You can make them run from terrifying monsters, and you can evoke a sense of dread at inevitable tragedy. And none of this is enough to make something scary. Because it's not fear of negative consequences where horror comes from. It's the fear of not knowing the consequences. What could be lurking in the darkness? What might that monster do if it catches you? And what nightmares are out there that you can't just wake up from? Horror needs the unknown. But how do you turn this into gameplay? After all, gameplay is about learning rules, recognizing patterns, and making progress through repetition. All things which make the unknown intimately familiar. And the challenges don't end there. A horror film usually has a runtime of under 2 hours, where only a fraction of that time is spent actually showing the scary subject matter. Video games, on the other hand, tend to run many more hours than this, and are often forced to show what's scary far more frequently. Then there is the challenge of balancing gameplay that is enjoyable with creating vulnerability through disempowerment, and of having consequences for failure that add tension that don't just become tedious, and of how to survive and create new experiences in a market obsessed with sequels and brand recognition. The unknown is elusive, and yet as challenging as making a good horror game can be, the rewards for horror fans can be all the greater. Horror films work through making you empathize with on-screen characters and then evoking dread and excitement over what might happen to them. Games, on the other hand, cast you, the player, in the starring role, making you one layer closer to what's happening. A movie might make you scared of what's around the corner, but a video game can force you to be the one who has to go and check. Games create agency. Survival becomes your responsibility. Events are made more immersive through participation, and the nightmare can penetrate closer. And then, at the end of it all, you're left with not only the satisfaction of overcoming gameplay challenges, but also the thrill of having faced your fears and made it out the other side alive. And there can be immense satisfaction in being scared and pushing forward to victory regardless. Horror is a fascinating genre, but there's still that problem of familiarity, and this is what ultimately explains much of its history. This is why the genre took so long to emerge, why it achieved such blistering success soon afterwards, and why it slowly mutated into something unrecognizable after that. It's why the indie horror scene proved so explosive, why the mainstream comeback of horror was so satisfying, and why the future of the genre is so unknowable. Humans are fascinated by horror, and horror doesn't get much more fascinating than in gaming. So let me tell you about all of it. But first, can I really begin an entire history of video without a definition? That's not a rhetorical question. Can I make a video like this without actually defining the subject of the video? Because it would certainly make life easier. That said, horror is unusual, as while most genres are based on styles of gameplay, horror is instead identified through the subject matter and the emotions evoked. Therefore, the simplest definition of a horror game is any game that places a heavy focus on trying to be scary. The word trying is important here. Some games might be very scary to certain people, but if that fear isn't a deliberate focus, or if it's not representative of most of the experience, they probably wouldn't be defined as horror games. Likewise, any game that makes clear attempts to be scary would probably still be considered a horror game, no matter how unsuccessful its attempt may be. Still, I think this definition doesn't cover something important, and can feel a little circular, as it's basically saying a horror game is any game that tries to be a horror game. Instead, to truly be classed as a horror game, there should probably be gameplay elements that are deliberately used to evoke a sense of horror, such as the disempowerment of the player character to make them feel more vulnerable, or limitations on resources to heighten tension. Survival horror games show these elements most clearly, as features like limited inventory spaces or saving restrictions might be seen as design flaws in other genres, yet can play an important role in enhancing horror. Still, in 2025, horror surely extends beyond just the classic survival formula, meaning the specific ways in which gameplay has been used have become more varied. But this definition means that games featuring horror subject matter without reflecting this in their gameplay design would not be classed as horror games. And so, despite featuring a wide range of classic horror monsters and taking heavy inspiration from one of the most famous horror stories of all time, something like Castlevania would not make the cut. Instead, this video aims to cover every major game in the genre's history, and as many not major but still important titles as can be fit in alongside them. And if a game is horror adjacent, it's less likely to be included, so that more time can be spent on those that most deserve it. And with that said, we can get to the first ever horror game. Right? For once, the first horror game is not an unsolvable mystery. Before there was Pong, there was the Magnavox Odyssey version of Pong, table tennis, which Pong famously copied. And on that very same Odyssey, there was Haunted House. This was one of 12 games included with the console in 1972, and makes for a great contender for first ever horror game by virtue of being one of the first commercial games ever made. The only problem is that it wasn't particularly horrifying. As with many Odyssey titles, the gameplay revolved around players controlling a white square on a black background with the use of a physical overlay, in this case the horror genre staple of a spooky mansion. Haunted House was two-player, with one person controlling a detective gathering clues, and the other a ghost who's trying to catch said detective. And while this might be charming in an antiquated manner, it's hard to imagine it as scary. And this is the problem with most early contenders. Like 1973's Hunt the Wampus, a text-based adventure game where you play hide-and-seek with a monster in a series of connected caves. These caves are in complete darkness, so players had to locate the Wampus by descriptions of its smell or sounds, but it's hard to argue this alone constitutes horror gameplay. Instead, the best contenders for first ever horror game arrive in the early 80s, with a trio of games released in close proximity. Haunted House on the Atari 2600, 3D Monster Maze on the ZX81, and Space Freighter Nostromo on the Commodore PET. Exactly which of these is the first depends on who you ask, or in the asocial age of the internet, where you look. For example, IGN's History of Survival Horror claims it was Haunted House, as does an old article on GameSpy. Meanwhile, in 2006, Edge magazine said it was 3D Monster Maze, while Kotaku and Giant Bomb both have pages on Nostromo describing it as the first survival horror game. These differences of opinions might have something to do with confusion over release dates, and look no further than Wikipedia for an example of this confusion. I mean, Wikipedia's list of horror games gives a release date of 1981 for Haunted House, but then on the actual page for Haunted House it says February 1982. Meanwhile, on 3D Monster Maze's page it says December 1981, but then the list of horror games that provides a source says it's December 1982. Nostromo is more straightforward. It is universally listed as December 1981, including by the man who made it, and I guess if anyone should know, it's him. Haunted House is also easy to solve, as more reliable sources confirm it to indeed be February 1982, which just leaves 3D Monster Maze, which really is 50-50, but the 81 claims seem less reliable. In fact, the Wikipedia source for a supposed 1981 release date, when actually checked, says that the game was completed in late 1981, but didn't launch until February 1982. And so, by process of elimination, I'm content to give the title of first horror game to Nostromo. Cue the applause. More importantly though, how are the actual games? Nostromo, as its name might suggest, was inspired by the hugely influential 1979 film Alien, and featured a player trapped aboard a spaceship who must avoid a deadly roaming at symbol. The graphics were rather basic, as tended to be the case in early PC games, but it's the gameplay that reveals its horror intent. Nostromo is a stealth game, with developer Akira Takiguchi being inspired by first ever stealth game contender Manbiki Shonen, or Shoplifting Boy. Takiguchi made one important change, however, as while Manbiki Shonen's shopkeeper is always visible, the alien instead moved in and out of sight depending on its location to create suspense and even basic jump scares. Nostromo also featured limited resources, with the player needing to move around and collect items to successfully escape, making it hard not to see this as horror-focused gameplay, even if the visuals are rudimentary. 3D Monster Maze also shows similarly impressive gameplay and similarly rudimentary visuals. The game featured a randomly generated maze that the player traversed in first person, but the player wasn't alone. 3D Monster Maze uses text to communicate how close your pursuer is, and you start seeing that text long before you actually see the monster, so as to build tension and create a sense of paranoia. Reading ominous warnings of "he is hunting you" or "run, he is beside you," followed by the very short period between the monster appearing and the player being eaten, is effective horror. And while the pixelated T-Rex itself might not hold up today, at least it's scarier than an @ sign. In fact, 3D Monster Maze's creator found it so effective that after making himself jump while testing the game late at night, he added a message into the beginning of the game warning players about it because he was worried he might get sued for giving someone a heart attack. Haunted House also forces players to run away, with no option to fight its various roaming bats, spiders, and ghosts. Navigating said house was made challenging by the fact that each doorway only allows travel in a single direction, either up or down but never both, and by its complete darkness, with the player's character represented only by his animated eyes. To win, you had to escape after collecting 3 parts of a magic urn, which you found using limited matches to light up your surroundings. Other challenges included locked doors and a chasing ghost, to create gameplay that, while basic, had much in common with later horror classics. It seems noteworthy that each of the big 3 first horror games was designed to deliberately disempower the player through restricting their vision. This was a time when games faced great technical limitations and didn't have the memory to display much on screen, and so these games seemingly embraced this limitation to turn it into an advantage, using the fear of not being able to see something, i.e. that important fear of the unknown, to generate the horror. Still, as impressive as these early attempts might have been, they weren't representative of the years that followed. In fact, it seems quite coincidental that these 3 games would all release within 3 months of each other, because for many years afterwards, examples of effective horror gameplay were rare. Although that wasn't down to a lack of horror-themed games. The 80s saw a boom of horror cinema following the success of classics like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, and Friday the 13th, which led to plenty of video game adaptations trying to cash in on this cultural trend, first on the Atari, and then later on the NES. Looking back today, however, makes it clear that most developers didn't really know how to make actual horror gameplay. Take 1983's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the Atari. where the player controls the villain, Leatherface, and earns points by running into and killing your victims, with the scariest thing that can happen being running out of gasoline for your chainsaw, something which doesn't really capture the spirit of the movie. Wizard Video's Halloween adaptation does a little better, in that at least you're trying to stop the killer this time, and yet the gameplay still feels like it's from a non-horror game. In it, you play as a babysitter, and score points by rescuing children and finding a knife that you can use to stab the pursuing Michael Myers. Score enough points through this and you can advance to the next level, where Michael gets faster. 1986's PC version of Friday the 13th shows further improvements to this formula, with the killer now able to hide amongst campers to surprise you, alongside more impressive pixelated gore when you discover a victim's corpse. Still, once you move into the NES era, these adaptations tend to just turn into side-scrolling action games or platformers, because that's what was popular at the time on consoles, so that's what horror games became. The same happened with various titles focused on popular horror icons like Dracula and Frankenstein, which there were plenty of in this period, probably because these IPs were old enough to be public domain, and having a recognizable name attached to your game helped sales in a time of little other marketing. And so these horror games tended to just copy the gameplay of non-horror titles with a horror-themed coat of paint, and even those paint jobs could be a bit splotchy. A slowly emerging interest in horror as a gameplay objective can still be seen elsewhere, however, like in arcades, with 1983's Sinistar, a seemingly conventional multi-directional shooter following on from the popular Asteroid, where you mine ore and shoot hostile drones until those drones finally complete their task.
Beware, I live.
The sudden and loud arrival of Sinistar, who continuously hunts you after this and can only be taken out if you've stored up enough missiles, was famous for scaring unsuspecting players, and no matter what you did or how high your score grew, it always kept coming back. Other early PC games also show a continued focus on disempowerment, like in Forbidden Forest for the Commodore 64, which Alexander Katsioanu, in the History of Horror Games book From Ants to Zombies, describes as ground zero for video game horror due to its emphasis on gameplay itself as a means to generate fear. That gameplay featured an archer moving through a forest, eliminating monsters as he goes, which probably sounds rather standard, and might have been, except for how all design decisions revolved around maximizing tension. Players had limited arrows, they had to stand still to aim and reload after each shot to increase vulnerability, and as time passed, day turned to night, and then to nightmare, as the forest grows more and more hostile. Failure also led to a surprisingly gory death unique to each enemy, and the soundtrack grows increasingly frantic to match the gameplay, all to instill a sense of dread. PC games would also continue to explore horror narratives through genres like point-and-click adventures or text adventures, which featured a range of themes and settings, with horror being one of the mainstays. Meanwhile, even if developers were still struggling to create horror gameplay, some still found other ways to horrify their player base. 1986's light gun arcade game Chiller famously courted controversy and found it, with many arcades refusing to stock it. Even today, it's not hard to see why, as the static shooting galleries the game presented put the player in the shoes of a torturer who must mutilate various helpless NPCs. Chiller was simple yet sadistic, and while its relatively basic gameplay is unimportant in the grand scheme of gaming's history, it still marked a new bar for gaming's ever-growing obsession with gore. Something continued by 1988's Splatterhouse, which still illustrates just how important visuals can be for the genre. On the one hand, Splatterhouse's action-heavy beat-em-up gameplay is a perfect example of the era's failure to match horror themes with effective horror gameplay. On the other hand, though, Splatterhouse is still one of the most visually impressive horror games relative to its time of release the genre has ever produced. Taking inspiration from an assortment of influences, from Cronenberg to Lovecraft to 80s slasher classics, Splatterhouse's combination of exaggerated body horror and careful attention to detail still looks great all these years later. In a time when many horror games were still more spooky than scary, and often aimed for a younger audience, Splatterhouse was unabashedly nightmarish, even if its simple beat-em-up action was comparatively mundane. Splatterhouse also promoted itself as being scary, with the TurboGrafx box art proudly declaring its horror themes as inappropriate for young children and cowards, which in some ways only highlights how far the genre actually still had to go in living up to its ambitions. But 1989 was the year that started to change. Project Firestart is the game that deserves the title usually given to games like Alone in the Dark, i.e., it was the first true survival horror game that featured all of the key elements you might expect from survival horror. Limited inventory and resource management, fixed camera angles, exploration, puzzle solving, and a disempowered protagonist who has to escape enemies instead of just killing them. What's more, Project Firestart didn't just do all these things several years before anyone else, it did them well, receiving strong reviews with particular praise for its atmosphere and ability to evoke dread. Its story again showed clear alien inspiration, with the player taking the role of a government agent sent to investigate a research ship that recently stopped communication, only to find the research has gone more than a little wrong. It was also a game that was trying to unsettle its player base. When asked about what led to the game's creation, Dynamics designer Jeff Tunnell recalls thinking about the question of, can a computer make you cry? And thinking, that might be kind of hard, but it could make you feel fear. And so, that's what they did, using many of the same techniques other games would later make famous. The action was slowed down, decisions were given weight, camera choices could keep enemies out of sight, the player was given just enough resources to survive but never enough to make that survival easy, and story elements were often told through notes on computers to preserve the constant feeling of isolation. You may wonder then why so few have heard of Project Firestart compared to other games we'll soon get to, but the answer has less to do with its design than its platform. The game's bold ambition led to a longer than expected development, meaning when it eventually released, it was at the very tail end of the Commodore 64's life. And unlike so many games in this video, low initial sales meant it never released on any other system to be able to reach a larger audience. Unlike the best-selling, history doesn't always remember the most innovative or original titles. Speaking of which, 1989 also saw Capcom's important horror RPG Sweet Home, a game that is well remembered despite its Japan-only release, thanks to the legendary series it would later help create. Sweet Home was developed alongside a horror film of the same name, and featured 5 documentarians who become trapped in an abandoned mansion. The game featured random encounters and combat reminiscent of popular JRPG Dragon Quest, but its non-combat elements show many survival horror staples, including unlimited inventory and healing, puzzle solving, and the need to switch between the 5 party members to access each one's unique skills, which were needed to progress and explore the monster-infested mansion. Yet, Sweet Home was far from the first horror-themed Japanese RPG. Shiryu Sensen War of the Dead, for example, released in 1987 and answered the important question of what if Zelda 2 was a horror game about fighting demons. Other Japan-only games from this era also risk being overlooked due to their lack of localization. But regardless of which of these games might have invented survival horror as we know the term, there's no question over which game popularized it. Infogrames' Alone in the Dark is one of the most important horror games ever made. But it was also a landmark in 3D game design, and it's in its presentation that it feels most remarkable. In fact, director Frederic Reynol's inspiration for the game came as much from his interest in horror films as his belief in the future of 3D graphics. The result was a game which shared many similarities to earlier point-and-click adventure games, like puzzle solving, exploration, and collecting items, yet was made much more immersive and intimate by the direct control given to the player in how they traverse and interact with the game's world. As early 90s technology meant 3D polygons were still difficult to implement, they were combined with pre-rendered backgrounds to cut down on processing power. But this pre-rendered quality in turn forced the camera to be fixed into set positions. Still, rather than being limited by this, Infogrames instead used it to their advantage, deliberately restricting the player's view to invoke fear and using a tank control system where the direction of movement stays consistent between camera changes. This allowed for a cinematic quality rarely seen at the time, as is immediately obvious by the diversity of camera shots used as the player arrived at the mansion in the game's opening. The creative freedom this provided was also used to enhance the horror, as the unsettling switch to a monster's point of view that's watching you arrive clearly illustrates. Alone in the Dark's gameplay still shows its adventure game roots, with combat often involving unique enemy encounters that were more like puzzles to solve than tests of action. The story was decidedly Lovecraftian, with the game originally intended to be an adaptation of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and this is still evident in the game's themes, enemies, and the notes the player finds to help them understand what happened to the mansion and what secrets lurk below. Alone in the Dark was also a major critical and commercial success, meaning even if other games had come before it, it was Alone in the Dark that games which came after tended to take inspiration from. And yet, survival horror wasn't the only area the genre was finding success at this time, and 3D wasn't the only new technological breakthrough. The CD-ROM also changed gaming in the 90s, giving developers unprecedented storage capacity and allowing for new features like full motion video. As horror games had long tried to emulate horror films, FMV provided a new opportunity to do that emulation more directly, leading to a short-lived but impactful wave of FMV horror games. Horror point-and-click adventures were already enjoying steady success, with examples like 1992's Dark Seed, which featured extensive artwork from H.R. Giger, showing their reach. FMV extended this reach though, like by bringing it to the United States Congress.
Night Trap, which adds a new dimension of violence specifically targeted against women, is especially repugnant. It ought to be taken off the market entirely, or at the very least, its most objectionable scenes should be removed.
Night Trap is a game famous for the controversy it created, but the most interesting thing about it might be how little it did to earn that notoriety. This early FMV game was marketed as an interactive movie, with gameplay revolving around watching live surveillance footage of a group of girls attacked by vampires during a sleepover. The player must then switch between different camera feeds, uncovering information through listening to conversations, and triggering traps to capture the vampires and save the girls. There was no blood, no gore, no nudity, little violence, and the vampires themselves were just masked men dressed in black who seemed far more goofy than scary. But that didn't matter to the media. In a time of Mortal Kombat-inspired panic around violence in video games, US senators blasted Night Trap for featuring gratuitous violence and promoting sexual aggression, while incorrectly claiming that the player's objective was to trap and kill the girls rather than save them.
About 2 months ago, I saw the video game Night Trap for the first time. It is a sick, disgusting video game in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse in my judgment.
This 1993 Senate hearing was a curious moment that speaks volumes about gaming status as a newly emerging and poorly understood medium in the early 90s. For horror games, however, Night Trap's large controversy over little substance shows one of the important challenges the genre faced in these times. I mean, just pay attention to Senator Lieberman's and Senator Cole's choice of words in this hearing.
Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture.
Mortal Kombat and Night Trap are not the kind of gifts that responsible parents give.
We have some basic responsibility in this country to protect children.
Night Trap wasn't just controversial because it was inaccurately portrayed by the media, it was controversial because it was assumed to be for children, as that's how all console games were viewed in this period, meaning any horror game for a console was seen as inappropriate by default. The earlier Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween for the Atari also led to controversy and retailers refusing to stock them, and if you look at many of the more successful horror games covered so far, you'll notice that most were for PC. This Senate hearing, which eventually led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board 1 year later, has ensured Night Trap's place in gaming history, but for FMV horror, more interesting games were still to come. Like 1993's The Seventh Guest, which more seamlessly blended FMV sequences with more involved adventure game puzzles and exploration. The Seventh Guest involved an amnesiac waking up in a haunted mansion and uncovering its past through visions of ghosts, and it was hugely successful, selling 2.3 million copies by 1997, making it one of the best-selling PC games of the decade. In fact, Bill Gates described it as the new standard in interactive entertainment, which was probably because, along with Myst, it helped out Microsoft by promoting CD drives as the new standard for home computers. In fact, optimism around CD-powered FMV games was so great that it led Take-Two to create a trilogy of high-budget adventure games featuring impressive A-list celebrity actors, including Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken. Still, perhaps the most fondly remembered FMV game of the era is 1995's Phantasmagoria from adventure game heavyweights Roberta Williams and Sierra Online, which featured so many FMV scenes that it came on 7 discs. It also cost several $1 million, with a production that ran over time and over budget, and involved building an entirely new film studio specifically for the game. And that might give you a hint as to why FMV games were not the future. Once CDs became the norm, the novelty of FMV wore off, leaving developers with high costs for no guarantee of greater sales. Still, Phantasmagoria was from a time when developers still believed, and aspects like the quantity of unique animations or the quality of the main actors' performances still show the format's potential. The story revolves around exploring a sinister mansion with a mysterious past, again, but the focus on the deteriorating relationship between the newlywed husband and wife at the heart of the story did at least help it stand out. Ultimately, however, the future of horror would not be FMV. Alone in the Dark sales were almost as high as the top-selling FMV games, and came without the costs of famous actors or dedicated film studios, meaning soon other games followed in its footsteps, including several direct sequels. Alone in the Dark 2 released in 1993 and made improvements to combat, which was one of the first game's more criticized aspects. One thing it did not improve, however, was the horror, with the unsettling Lovecraftian aspects of the first game swapped out for a focus on mobsters, pirates, and not entirely convincing voodoo magic. There was more action, marking the start of a trend seen in many horror game series, but the decreased focus on tension or dread raises questions over whether this was still a survival horror game or simply another adventure game with horror elements. Luckily, there would be other Alone in the Dark successors, like 1994's Dr. Hauser, which featured similar exploration, puzzle solving, and tank-controlled gameplay, alongside a similar lone guy investigating an abandoned mansion with a mysterious past story. One feature which did differentiate Dr. Hauser was its use of fully 3D environments in place of pre-renders, which allowed the player to freely switch to additional first-person and top-down perspectives. This was a time when developers were just starting to experiment with 3D, as can also be seen in Ecstatica, another noteworthy game released that same year. Ecstatica's ellipsoid-based models might look rather cartoony today, but they allowed for characters to be depicted more efficiently by using fewer shapes, and helped create some impressively advanced animations. Ecstatica was also far from cartoony in subject matter, with its medieval town graphically ransacked by monsters and a clearly disempowered protagonist who was regularly forced to run while being stalked by unkillable werewolves. 1995 would bring Alone in the Dark 3, this time with a Wild West theme, but few further advancements in horror. In Japan, however, developers were starting to get more creative, like in D, an interactive movie-style adventure game from Maverick game designer Kenji Eno. D shows similarities to other FMV games featured earlier, but used computer-generated video rather than live action, and ran entirely in real time, with no pause or save function for its entire 2-hour duration. This made this particular movie game much more movie-like than most, with not only an attempt at cinematic style, but also cinematic pacing that often stayed light on gameplay to focus more on its ambitious story of a woman trying to find her father after he went on an unexplainable killing spree. D was highly creative, but it wouldn't be the most important horror game that year. Clock Tower released exclusively in Japan at the twilight of the Super Nintendo's reign and finally accomplished what so many games before it had aspired to, translating the thrills of a slasher film into gameplay. That said, Clock Tower was not inspired by the popular American horror films of the 80s, but rather director Dario Argento and the giallo genre of Italian horror from the 70s. This is reflected in Clock Tower's aesthetic, with its main character Jennifer being an almost direct copy of the character Jennifer from the film Phenomena. Still, it was its gameplay that really defined Clock Tower, as it took the familiar exploring a sinister mansion premise and point-and-click adventure gameplay and added in something other games often lacked: actual danger. Throughout the game, the player is stalked by Scissorman, who shows up in unexpected places and chases you continuously. The player has no way to fight back, and so is forced to rely on traps, hiding places, and their own ingenuity to survive, creating a clear feeling of disempowerment against this constant, relentless threat. Through this, Clock Tower didn't just reference the chase scenes from the films that inspired it, but rather recreated them in video game form, with the player taking the role of prey, turning the thrill of watching someone try to escape into the thrill of being the one fighting for your life and barely making it out alive. Or not. In many ways, this is the dream of horror games. Not some desire to copy movies and match their scares, but rather to go one better and take advantage of the strengths of the medium to create experiences people can't get somewhere else. And it seems fitting that by 1995, horror games had accomplished this, because after 14 years of tentative advancements, controversies, and complications, the genre was finally about to have its true breakthrough moment. Sometimes there are games which divide an entire genre into before and after. Resident Evil is one of them. The game began development as a successor to Capcom's earlier Sweet Home, which the director, Takuro Fujiwara, had felt was held back as a horror game by the Famicom's limited graphics. Fujiwara felt the new PlayStation 1's prowess would finally allow him to create the game he had always wanted Sweet Home to be. To do this, he turned to rookie director Shinji Mikami, who was famously chosen because he hated being scared, something Fujiwara saw as important, with him later saying that people who aren't afraid of anything don't understand what's frightening, and you can't make a horror game if you don't have fear. And this was key to Resident Evil's success. So many of its features were lifted straight from Sweet Home, like its mansion setting and puzzle solving, or were inspired by Alone in the Dark, like the fixed camera and tank controls or dual protagonists, or had simply been done already and done well by Project Firestart years earlier. What made Resident Evil different wasn't its features, it was its horror. Resident Evil committed to the genre, trying to push the bar further, to unsettle and to unnerve. This led to some pushback during its development, with some at Capcom worrying that the game went too far, but Fujiwara's response wasn't to dial things back, but rather the opposite, encouraging the team to make it even nastier. And many of Resident Evil's most famous scares still work all these years later. Take the player's first meeting with a zombie, shown via an iconic, unique cutscene. Or the frequent use of camera angles to obscure rather than show your enemies. Or its willingness to toy with players' expectations, like when two zombie dogs suddenly break through the window of a static background to unexpectedly ambush you. But Resident Evil didn't just create scripted scares. Arguably, its most important gameplay innovation was its save system, which worked via limited ink ribbons the player could scavenge and had to spend each time they wanted to secure their progress. This created a constantly rising tension that would grow the further from a safe room the player got, with all responsibility given to the player, who has to decide whether to continue forward or turn back, and whether to ration ink ribbons or risk even worse trouble by running out of them later on. Resident Evil was at its most effective when you're a long way from home, having already used up most of your resources and desperate to restock and save your progress, and you have to decide whether to enter the door to an unknown room, unsure if what's on the other side is the safe room you desperately need, or danger even worse than you've already encountered. The decision to go through that door and the dread about what could be in there waiting for you is the type of horror only games can produce, and was at the heart of the survival horror genre Resident Evil inspired. And Resident Evil did inspire. Before Resident Evil, horror was a theme for other genres, like text adventures or point-and-click adventures, to portray, and portray it they did. But after Resident Evil, horror was the genre, and RE's particular formula would be the one most other developers copied. Through this, horror found a new home on consoles, a market previously largely overlooked as it was seen for children, which was now able to finally flourish. By December of the following year, Resident Evil 1 had passed 4 million copies sold, which for a time made it the best-selling game on the PlayStation 1. In fact, Resident Evil was so successful that its influence spread beyond its own medium. For so many years, horror games had copied horror movies, but Resident Evil flipped this on its head by bringing zombies back into the mainstream, with a new wave of zombie media all citing it as a direct influence, including 28 Days Later, Shaun of the Dead, and the Walking Dead comic. Although, admittedly, this wasn't quite caused by Resident Evil alone. 1996 would also see the arrival of the light gun shooter, The House of the Dead, which featured a similar science-gone-wrong zombie outbreak for players to survive, and was a major hit, becoming one of the best-selling dedicated arcade games of its era, and receiving multiple sequels. Clock Tower 2 also released that year, which, unlike its predecessor, did release outside of Japan, where it was simply titled Clock Tower, following the Final Fantasy formula of creating decades of naming confusion through trying to prevent naming confusion by using different numbers in different regions. Clock Tower 2 continued the story of the original and featured similar point, click, and flee gameplay, but switched to 3D after its director saw the announcement of Resident Evil and felt 3D graphics were needed to compete with it. 1996 also brought a successor to D in Enemy Zero, which, like Kenji Eno's previous work, was as ambitious as it was original. Enemy Zero was not related to D, but it did feature the same main character, Laura, who Enno saw as a digital actress playing a different role. Enemy Zero featured a mix of interactive FMV sequences alongside real-time first-person exploration. In it, Laura wakes up from cryogenic sleep aboard a spaceship overrun with invisible aliens. These were the main enemies the player faced, and they really were invisible, meaning players had to rely on sound to fight them. A tracker changed pitch and frequency as enemies approached, allowing players to shoot them with a carefully timed charge blast just before they attacked. This built heavy tension, with the adage of what you can't see being scarier than what you can taken to an extreme in what remains a highly innovative sensory-based gameplay system that shows just how different the horror genre might have been if it had explored different directions. Instead, the direction for horror's future was trying to top Resident Evil. 1997 would be a quiet year for the genre, but in 1998 the response to Capcom's classic arrived, and they were led by Resident Evil itself. How to make a successful sequel has been a recurring challenge for the horror genre in games and movies alike. Or, as the self-aware horror sequel Scream 2 once said,
"Who'd want to do that? Sequels suck." No, come on, man. The entire horror genre was destroyed by sequels.
the simplest reason for this is that horror relies on the unknown, and sequels are inherently familiar, which means doing the same thing again tends to produce rapidly diminishing returns. To prevent this, both movies and games often take the same approach of increasing the horror elements in an attempt to top what came before, which can create a risk that this exaggeration gets taken too far. Resident Evil 2, however, shows how to up the stakes successfully. While the first game begins slowly, with a drawn-out build-up to its first zombie encounter before the player starts taking on undead foes one at a time, Resident Evil 2 drops the player straight into the middle of a zombie outbreak in a densely populated city and forces you to survive entire screens full of zombies before you even get a chance to familiarize yourself with the controls. What followed was a similar game to what came before, with an emphasis on more. Environments were more varied, enemies were more deadly, boss fights were more explosive, and to go alongside the returning choice of two characters was an A and B path system, where playing the game for a second time with the other protagonist introduced a number of new changes, including different item placements and a new unkillable enemy to stalk the player called Mr. X. This ensured even a repeat playthrough didn't fall prey of being too familiar to be scary. But even all the way back in 1998, astute observers may have wondered just how long Capcom could continue with this same strategy. Regardless, for Resident Evil 2 it paid off, and the numerous improvements to the graphics and presentation helped ensure critical acclaim and even greater sales than the first game. Capcom weren't the only developer trying to top Resident Evil, however, as in 1998, the era of RE clones officially began. Famed JRPG developer Square would release Parasite Eve, combining Resident Evil-inspired survival horror with Final Fantasy-level presentation and turn-based random encounters. Sega's answer came with Deep Fear, which sought to emulate Resident Evil's gameplay with a story inspired by The Thing that was set in an underwater research facility where an infection was transforming people into mutants. Polygon Magic's Galarians mixed Resident Evil-inspired gameplay with a heavy dose of teenage angst and psychic powers, and Resident Evil's director, Shinji Mikami, would take a break from the series to create Dino Crisis, which again stayed true to the RE gameplay formula, but featured 3D environments rather than pre-renders, and dinosaurs instead of zombies, which Mikami hoped would produce a more visceral and panicked response in players, leading Capcom to market the game as panic horror. Still, the most famous challenger to RE's crown came from Konami and Team Silent.
What is this? What's going on here?
Silent Hill released in early 1999 and marked an important step for psychological horror in video games. Psychological horror emphasizes feelings of unease and dread instead of the horror from physical threats represented by monsters or violence, and had been largely neglected by gaming over the more immediate thrills provided by chase sequences and intense combat. Silent Hill did show similarities to Resident Evil's design, albeit with 3D environments instead of pre-renders, but by comparison, its combat was easier, its resource management more stripped down with no limited saving, and its exploration was quieter. And so instead of Resident Evil's tension through gameplay, Silent Hill used the atmosphere of its story, setting, visuals, and sound design to create an oppressive feeling of dread that hung over the entire experience, much like the pervasive fog that blankets the eponymous town. Through this, Silent Hill set itself apart from its competition, which director Keiichiro Toyama has said was his intent. In fact, many parts of Silent Hill can be understood as an inverse of Resident Evil. Silent Hill's horror was that of an unexplainable nightmare, whereas for as crazy as the Resident Evil series can be, it always adhered to the rule of explaining all supernatural elements through rational science. Silent Hill's town was wide and disorientingly open, compared to Resident Evil's claustrophobic, tightly designed single locations, and Silent Hill's protagonist was a relatively weak everyman unused to combat, compared to Resident Evil's ensemble of wisecracking supercops. And so, Silent Hill offered something different and original, and in doing so, it answered the question of how to make a successful horror successor. In a genre that thrives off the unknown, maybe you should try to be different. There were other games from this era that also stood out by being different, like Atlus's Hell Knight, a first-person PS1 game about escaping a shape-shifting monster within an underground maze buried deep beneath Tokyo. Hell Knight featured zero combat, with gameplay focused on running and avoiding your pursuer, making it somewhat reminiscent of the much earlier 3D Monster Maze. There was also the genre-mixing System Shock 2, which combined elements of immersive sims, first-person shooters, and RPGs, alongside a much stronger horror focus than its predecessor. Still, the most dominant name in horror continued to be Resident Evil, which released its third entry only a year and a half after Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 3 continued the trend of trying to one-up what came before, this time through the introduction of the Nemesis, a recurring unkillable foe who relentlessly pursues the player and was inspired by the T-1000 from Terminator 2. Through this, Shinji Mikami wanted to instill a persistent feeling of paranoia in the player, and Nemesis was arguably the most intimidating threat the series had seen. Resident Evil 3 also introduced more action mechanics, including a quick turn and a new dodge ability. Resident Evil's next entry arrived just 5 months later. Code Veronica released in early 2000 on the brand new Dreamcast and made the jump to full 3D environments alongside a more dynamic camera. As the first next-gen Resident Evil, Code Veronica's technical improvements were enough to wow critics, but for the first time for an RE game, it was hard to see Code Veronica as doing anything to evolve the survival horror formula. Luckily, more original titles were still coming out as well, including from Capcom themselves, who released Onimusha in early 2001, which swapped shotguns for samurai swords to answer the question of what if Resident Evil was set in Sengoku-era Japan. The Dreamcast would also receive a more experimental horror game in Illbleed. Crazy Games' previous work, Blue Stinger, was an early Dreamcast title that stuck closer to Resident Evil-inspired action-adventure game design, but Illbleed was a more bizarre and over-the-top take on B-movie horror that was known for its dark humor, amusement park setting, and unconventional game mechanics that relied on the protagonist's senses to detect traps and scares before triggering them. Outside Japan, EA would also release Clive Barker's Undying that year, a supernatural first-person shooter rich in gothic horror from acclaimed author Clive Barker, who was heavily involved in the design process. And outside both Japan and the West, Korean developer Sonuri would release sleeper hit White Day, A Labyrinth Named School only in Korea. White Day combined immersive first-person exploration, puzzle solving, and visual novel-style storytelling inside a haunted school, and was a rare example of Asian horror from a non-Japanese developer. Its sales were too low to receive an international release, but its cult status in Korea and word of mouth online slowly spread the game to English audiences, first with an unofficial fan patch, and then an official remake in 2015. 2001 also saw the return of Alone in the Dark in The New Nightmare, which soft rebooted the series by bringing long-running protagonist Edward Carnby back in a very different adventure. In a testament to just how dominant Resident Evil was in this period, the series which helped inspire it was now copying it instead. The New Nightmare was a far darker, edgier, and more overtly horror-focused experience than any of the Alone in the Dark games that preceded it. It would also increase the focus on combat, adding a flashlight mechanic and more demanding resource management, while ditching its more 3D-inspired backgrounds for RE-style pre-renders, which was somewhat ironic given how most series, including Resident Evil, were doing the opposite in this period. Ultimately, The New Nightmare was a success and saw positive sales, but couldn't match the new king of the horror hill. And speaking of hills, Silent Hill 2 released 2 years after the first entry and raised the bar for horror storytelling in gaming. While much about the game remained similar, including its fog-covered setting, Silent Hill 2 moved its narrative focus away from the demonic cult activity of the first game towards the inner trauma and turmoil of its characters. The idea of connecting the horror in the game world that we see and interact with the horror inside someone's mind from trauma, guilt, or a damaged mental state, has become so common within gaming that it now risks feeling overused and almost passé. When Silent Hill 2 did it, however, this was not the case, and it is likely the effectiveness and impact of Silent Hill 2's use of this trope that is responsible for it becoming so widespread. Silent Hill 2 told the story of James Sunderland, a widower who receives a letter from his recently deceased wife telling him to come to Silent Hill to meet her. His journey sees him descend deeper and deeper into a surreal hell, and yet no matter how horrifying the nightmare becomes, Silent Hill 2 never loses sight of its humanity.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did.
Years later, Silent Hill 2 is often held as not just one of the greatest stories in horror, but in all of gaming. But not every sequel can guarantee the quality of Silent Hill 2, and by 2001, there were the first signs that the genre might be struggling to move forwards. For one thing, the next Resident Evil was not Resident Evil. Devil May Cry is not a horror game, but it began development as the first incarnation of Resident Evil 4, with Hideki Kamiya, the director of RE2, returning to oversee the project. And yet it ended up straying so far from the survival horror of the original games that Shinji Mikami felt compelled to intervene to convince Capcom it needed to be its own thing. If you're familiar with Devil May Cry, you may wonder how it could ever have been a Resident Evil title. But it turned out, Resident Evil was on the verge of an identity crisis. In early 2002, Capcom would release a remake of Resident Evil 1 that remade the game from the ground up in the same style but with next-gen graphics and expanded gameplay features. This remake is regularly held as the definitive version of the game and involved many of the original developers, with returning director Mikami viewing it as closer to his original vision. It also received great reviews, was the pinnacle of this particular visual style, and has remained as one of the most acclaimed horror games ever since. And yet, despite all this, Resident Evil Remake sold poorly. In fact, its sales were so far below expectations that it permanently changed the entire trajectory of the series, which likely changed the trajectory of the entire genre, and left Mikami later referring to his disappointment as a lingering trauma. And yet, Remake wasn't the only data point. Later that year, the series would receive another entry in Resident Evil Zero, a prequel to the original game that would retain much of the classic gameplay alongside the next-gen quality pre-renders used in Remake. To add something new to Resident Evil's now familiar formula, Zero allowed players to control both protagonists with the ability to switch between them and travel together or separate. Similar to its original inspiration, Sweet Home, each protagonist would have slightly different abilities, and this was the key to solving many of the game's puzzles. And yet, this wasn't enough to impress reviewers, with Zero being criticized for seeming too stuck in the past, particularly in its tank controls, which were increasingly seen as outdated, and once again, it sold far fewer copies than earlier entries. So, horror was undergoing a change, in reputation if not yet game design. And yet there were still many survival horror classics in this era, like Tecmo's Fatal Frame, also known as Zero in Japan and Project Zero in Europe. After Resident Evil's breakthrough, horror was dominated by Japanese developers, but those developers were usually emulating Western influences to create games that would appeal to Western markets. Fatal Frame, however, wore its Japanese influences proudly, telling a story of two siblings exploring a haunted mansion that gave off a deeply unsettling eeriness, much more understated than the more visceral horror of so many other games from this period. Fatal Frame's most famous feature was its camera-based combat, where ghosts were warded off by taking photos of them. This forced players to look directly at what was scary, in contrast to the genre's tradition of running away from it, and helped Fatal Frame to stand out in a time of heavy competition. And so, despite Resident Evil's wobble, there was still plenty of life in the horror genre. 2002 would also bring a third sequel to Clock Tower, as well as a successful adaptation of The Thing, which combined survival horror with squad-based third-person shooting, in a sign of what might be to come for the genre. Meanwhile, one of the year's biggest surprises came from GameCube exclusive Eternal Darkness, which was the first ever Nintendo game to receive a mature age rating. Eternal Darkness featured simple survival horror gameplay, with more modern third-person camera controls and combat, in a Lovecraftian-infused story that stood out for its use of multiple characters across 2,000 years of history. Still, Eternal Darkness's best feature was its pioneering sanity mechanics, which broke the fourth wall in numerous unexpected ways to target the player rather than just their character. These sanity effects started to trigger if the player's sanity meter was dropped too low from enemy encounters, and included the more mundane, strange noises and visual changes to the environments, to the more creative, fake deaths, open doors becoming locked, and simulated TV errors or game crashes. In fact, the system was so impressive that Nintendo locked it away through a patent to prevent anyone copying it, before the game's unexpectedly poor sales doomed any chance of a sequel. 20 years later, that patent finally expired, but Eternal Darkness's depiction of insanity has still rarely been matched. 2003 would bring another sequel to Silent Hill, which increased the series' oppressive atmosphere to even more uncomfortable levels in its fan-favourite third entry. A sequel to Fatal Frame at the end of the year would be similarly successful, with Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly, often held as the best entry in the series thanks to its strong story and subtle improvements to gameplay. A new take on Japanese-inspired horror would also arrive that year in Siren, which was created by many of the original developers behind Silent Hill, including director Keiichiro Toyama. Siren featured a sight-jacking mechanic, which the player can use to see through the eyes of nearby enemies, allowing it to replicate the villain point-of-view shots used so often in horror cinema to increase tension, while incorporating this into its stealth-heavy gameplay as the primary tool the player has to help them avoid enemies. 2003 also brought the controversial release of Manhunt, which let players step into the shoes of a death row inmate forced to star in a series of snuff films about killing local gang members with your exploits captured on CCTV, alongside ratings based on executions and instructions from a mysterious director played by Brian Cox. Manhunt was divisive, even within Rockstar, with one employee later saying, quote, "There was almost a mutiny at the company over the game, and that it just made us all feel icky." It's hardly surprising then that Manhunt reignited discussions over violence in video games, and yet at the same time it also showed how far horror had come. When Night Trap appeared before US senators in 1993, horror was controversial no matter how tame, because consoles were seen as for kids. 10 years later, however, horror no longer had to censor itself, and had proven it was here to stay, no matter how much some outside the industry had a problem with this. But that didn't mean horror was done evolving, a fact which Resident Evil would soon make obvious. Yet this was hardly the result of a single game, and titles like 2004's The Suffering gave an early sign of horror's more action-heavy future. The Suffering featured another death row inmate, this time accused of murdering his family and locked away in a prison that comes under attack from supernatural monsters. Unlike the constrained resource management and carefully considered combat of survival horror classics, however, The Suffering simplified player decision-making to being all about action. Envisioned as the frantic gameplay of Devil May Cry meets the horror setting of Resident Evil, The Suffering allowed players to cut through enemies in waves without ever pondering a need to run away, and it wasn't the only game to blur lines between genres that year. Doom 3 would also surprise players by turning off the lights and introducing a new emphasis on horror, showing just how mainstream horror had become by this point. 2004 also saw the release of the more obscure, gaming's best impersonation of an early 2000s American teen movie, down to the quintessentially noughties punk rock-infused soundtrack. Obscure survival horror gameplay does little to stand out today, but it did include the novel feature of full co-op, predating many other horror games in offering something that became an important part of the genre's future. In 2005, however, horror would truly change, as the genre's most important series reinvented itself to staggering success, and attitudes and expectations forever changed in its wake. But survival horror never fully died. Instead, it would spend years lurking in action horror's shadow, only to resurface in both new and familiar ways almost a decade later. The change towards favouring action also didn't happen overnight, and the final years of the PlayStation 2 would continue to produce several future classics. Capcom released their spiritual successor to Clock Tower in Haunting Grounds, which gave players an updated take on the run-and-hide formula, alongside one of gaming's bestest boys. Moral panic over video game horror would get a new season in the flawed but psychologically gripping Rule of Rose, and series like Siren and Fatal Frame would get new, well-regarded entries. Still, there's no denying which game defined the rest of the decade. How do you make a good horror sequel? Cinema had struggled with this question long before games ever did, and games had struggled with it long before Resident Evil 4 did what it did. Resident Evil 2's answer was to one-up the first game. Resident Evil 3's answer was to introduce a new challenge in Nemesis, but by late 2002, neither one-upping nor new features seemed to be enough. While Resident Evil Remake was failing to sell, and Resident Evil 0 was being criticized for seeming stale and outdated, the fourth mainline entry in the series was experiencing hell. Development hell, that is, as Devil May Cry was not the only failed Resident Evil 4. In total, 4 separate versions of the game were started and then discarded, as Capcom wrestled with the true nightmare of the horror genre. How do you make a good horror sequel? Trailers and gameplay footage of these aborted versions still exist, showing features similar to what came before, including the classic zombies, a mansion-like setting, and the use of fixed camera angles. Yet none were deemed good enough, and in the end, Shinji Mikami returned to once more take over directorial duties and create the game everyone knows and loves today. His reason for making such drastic changes were simple. In an interview, Mikami said Resident Evil Zero had felt like just more of the same, and that only after changing to a new system did he manage to feel scared again. And so, the genre's most significant change didn't come from a desire to move away from horror, but rather the opposite. Resident Evil 4 was an attempt to recapture the feeling of the unknown that had been lost in 8 years of survival horror saturation that followed the original title's success. And this worked. The introductory sequence in Resident Evil 4, where returning protagonist Leon Kennedy arrives at an unnamed European village, is as horror-inducing as anything seen in a Resident Evil game before it. The unnerving encounter with your first enemy, a human, not zombie this time, who is just as intent on doing you harm and considerably more capable. The sense of isolation as your driver abandons you. The creeping dread as you make your way up to the village. And the pulse-pounding terror as the first real fight begins, and then just doesn't end. As the enemies keep coming and coming, as the barricades that once stopped zombies no longer prove enough, and as a large man with a chainsaw tanks shotgun blasts to the face and still keeps chasing you, giving you no time to think, no room to breathe, and no chance to do anything but fight for your life in a desperate struggle for pure survival. It might be easy to forget, but once upon a time, Resident Evil 4 was scary. Still, some things did change, like the tank controls and fixed cameras, which were replaced by a more modern over-the-shoulder third-person view. Resident Evil 4 can risk being overpraised for its third-person controls. Successful third-person shooters existed years before it, and its camera is not actually freely controllable in the way modern players might expect. Still, it did make a vital step forward by using an offset camera position that allows the player to get much closer to the action without that action being obscured. This allowed for a more immersive, intimate, and potentially claustrophobic camera position perfect for the horror genre, and which became the standard for nearly all third-person shooters going forward. Resident Evil 4 also changed the intensity and frequency of the action. Resident Evil 1 was a slow, deliberate experience where tension was built and resolved over tens of minutes. Resident Evil 4 still involved tension and still disempowered the player by forcing you to stand still to aim and reload, but its main tension tended to be built and resolved over seconds. Will you make or miss that headshot? Do you have time to reload and shoot before these enemies reach you? And will that guy with the chainsaw ever just fuck off and die already? It's this change of intensity that makes it fitting to describe RE4 as an action horror game rather than survival horror. And with this change comes a lowering of the importance in resource management and decision making, as combat became the default solution to almost every problem. But to go as far as to say that Resident Evil 4 is no longer a horror game seems grossly unfair. If this game had completely failed at horror, it would not be one of the most acclaimed games ever made. What risks being forgotten is that the very things that once made RE4's horror so effective, its changing of established rules, its intensity, its fresh set of challenges, are now just part of an industry standard that does the exact opposite, rendering them familiar and less scary to a modern player base with years of experience of fighting using third-person controls, but who look at tank controls as a relic of a bygone age, as mysterious as they are unwieldy. And so, Resident Evil 4 did change horror, but what was the alternative? By the end of the PS2, survival horror was not matching its past success. I mean, just look at Resident Evil Remake, a game which heavily shaped the RE4 the world ended up with. You could argue the horror genre was as changed by a great game doing well as it was by a different great game being ignored. Still, other series showed similar problems and similar trajectories. Even the greatest horror series were struggling to live up to their predecessors' acclaim. Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, Clock Tower all show this trend. Meanwhile, the general pattern towards action increasing and horror decreasing can be seen even clearer. Dino Crisis, Galarians, D2, Onimusha, Alone in the Dark all show this, and other games soon to come would provide many more examples. Even Silent Hill, one of the series that seemed most immune to the need to constantly exaggerate and increase action, was still doing this. Silent Hill 3 added a parrying system, which did increase the complexity of the series' quite shallow combat, but parrying is clearly an empowering mechanic, not a disempowering one. To go alongside this, Silent Hill 3 basically doubled the number of enemies you face to maintain its desired sense of hostility, but how long can a series keep doing that? Silent Hill 4 upped the hostility once more, and became a much more controversial title because of it. And so Resident Evil 4 wasn't an isolated example, and in many ways was as much part of a trend as the cause of it. And if you need more proof, just look at some of the other horror games released that year. Cold Fear released just 2 months after RE4 and was likely overshadowed by RE4 because of this, but there's plenty about the two games which are very similar, like the offset over-the-shoulder aiming, although Cold Fear does use several fixed camera perspectives when not aiming. Still, this is again a more action-focused take on the genre, which stood out for its impressive ship physics and weather effects that created sway the player needs to compensate for when aiming, and knocks you around when on deck. Fear, or First Encounter Assault Recon, also released in 2005 to provide one of horror's most memorable first-person shooters, and some of gaming's most competent enemy AI. Fear included fast, tactical gunfights that had little in common with the slow survival horror of the previous decade, alongside prolonged stretches of quiet used to build atmosphere and a sense of dread. Fear took heavy influence from Japanese horror films, and its antagonist, the young psychic Alma, is a persistent presence haunting the player between every exhilarating firefight. Surprisingly, Fear wasn't Monolith's only horror hit that year, as they also released the Xbox 360 launch title, Condemned: Criminal Origins. In contrast to Fear's clinical shooting, Condemned featured a melee-heavy combat system that emphasized visceral brutality, with improvised weapons that created desperate struggles for survival. Its story cast players as an FBI agent investigating a serial killer and experiencing what I think is colloquially known as a bad day at the office. Condemned impressed reviewers with its next-gen presentation, and once more proved the viability of action in horror. These 3 games all released close enough to Resident Evil 4 that they were unlikely to be heavily influenced by it, but in time the impact of RE4 can be seen, particularly in the struggles of certain other series. Silent Hill's next entry was Origins, which released in 2007 on the PlayStation Portable and later on the PS2. Unlike each of the previous games, Origins was not developed by Team Silent, with Konami deciding to disband the veteran horror studio in favor of using various Western developers, each notably inexperienced with horror. Origins shows this inexperience, as while much of the gameplay and setting were retained, there was a clear lack of confidence in just how closely Origins stuck to its inspirations. It begins with a similar near-car crash outside the town that functions as its inciting incident. Its enemies included the same faceless nurses from Silent Hill 2 and a Pyramid Head clone in The Butcher, and its story acted as a prequel to the first game and retrod mostly familiar ground. Gameplay was where Origins was most different, as it introduced a greater combat focus with breakable weapons, grappling and counter moves, and even quick-time events during key moments. But overall, the game was still largely seen as disappointing. In 2008, the disappointments continued with Homecoming, the first next-gen Silent Hill and the first ever game from its developer Double Helix. Homecoming introduced an ever greater focus on combat, following a more action game control scheme with light and heavy attacks, dodging and countering, and a lock-on system. This came at the cost of less focus on puzzles, exploration, and resource management. It was also seen as having a much more Western style of horror focused on violence and gore more than atmosphere, and for copying visual and audio elements from the poorly received Silent Hill movie rather than the original games. Still, its most controversial feature was its reuse of Pyramid Head, a character that had no narrative reason to exist outside Silent Hill 2, and which drew criticism from fans before the game was even released. In fact, Homecoming was so much of a Western-centric departure for the series that Konami didn't even release the game in its home market of Japan. Despite this, it did not impress Western audiences, who saw its focus on action at the cost of all else as a betrayal of the series. Other series also had trouble adapting to the action-heavy times. Alone in the Dark would receive its second reboot in 2008, which featured a range of ambitious ideas, including an immersive inventory system, physics-based puzzles, and open-world sections, yet struggled with the implementation of these ideas and was heavily panned by critics. Siren also saw a third title that same year in Blood Curse, which retained its stealth-heavy sight-jacking gameplay alongside more modern third-person controls, and yet became the final entry in the series. And Fatal Frame received its fourth entry, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, which took advantage of the Wii's controller for its iconic camera combat, yet only released in Japan after the planned Western localization was cancelled by Nintendo, presumably due to sales concerns. Meanwhile, the Wii's explosive success led to a renewed interest in rail shooters, which seemed a natural fit for motion controls. This led to a range of games, including multiple Resident Evils, more House of the Dead, and even a Silent Hill attempt in Silent Hill the Arcade. Yet this resurgence left little lasting impact on the genre, with even the best games failing to resonate with traditional horror audiences. Instead, the horror games which found most success at this time seemed to be those which were not shackled by past traditions and which could embrace action more completely, like 2007's BioShock, which was a spiritual successor to the System Shock series. Set in the underwater city of Rapture, where libertarian dreams had turned to nightmares, BioShock was a return to System Shock 2's genre mixing with FPS combat, RPG-like upgrades, and horror atmosphere. Despite this, its design was heavily influenced by Resident Evil 4, with the developers inspired by RE4's use of environments to create tactical choices in combat, and its emphasis on action without overly empowering the player. In fact, there was a time when RE4 could have been an even greater influence, with BioShock originally featuring an RE-inspired inventory system and debate over whether to break from the first-person point of view in important story scenes due to RE4's successful use of cutscenes. Ultimately, BioShock was a huge success due to the strength of its narrative, presentation, and setting, but its action gameplay surely helped bring horror to mainstream audiences in a console generation dominated by first and third-person shooters. And speaking of dominant shooters, Valve's Left 4 Dead would provide another action-heavy horror experience that found plenty of mainstream success. Left 4 Dead was a product of the early 2000s zombie mania started by Resident Evil 1, but by 2008, zombies were arguably starting to feel overused. It's fortunate then that Left 4 Dead largely ignored the familiarity-killing horror problem by using its undead for exhilarating FPS co-op action instead of unsettling dread. And Left 4 Dead, and its even more successful sequel, were one of the 7th gen's defining co-op experiences, predicting the future trend of co-op horror and showing that for many people, horror games didn't always need to be scary to be fun. Yet there were games which combined action gameplay and fear successfully, like 2008's other big horror title. Dead Space began development as a different game, taking its influence from System Shock and being envisioned as the third entry in the series. But the success of RE4 changed this, with Resident Evil in Space becoming a leading design principle, and causing a shift from first person to third, as well as turning Dead Space into its own new IP. The result was one of horror's greatest sci-fi titles. Severing limbs to take down enemy necromorphs provided a varied and intense gameplay challenge, The diegetic HUD and minimal UI benefited immersion, with menus even retaining tension by needing to be navigated in real time, and its atmospheric, abandoned spaceship setting and stellar presentation retained the ability to make players scared of what's lurking in the darkness and terrified when they actually found out. Just like Resident Evil 4 3 years earlier, Dead Space proved the effectiveness of action horror, but the true onus lay with the series which led to this trend. Resident Evil 5 released in early 2009 and saw Capcom once more wrestling with the challenge of making an effective horror sequel. Their solution in retrospect seems predictable. Resident Evil 4 found record success by adding a focus on action, so Capcom increased the action. More enemies for the players to take on at a time, more quick-time event-filled cinematic set pieces, bigger and crazier boss fights, turret sequences, slow-motion backflips, boulder punching, and to top it all off, the key ingredient to any horror sequel, something new to stop the experience feeling overly familiar, which this time turned out to be co-op. The problem with this in retrospect should be obvious. None of it is effective horror. Co-op has an important place in gaming, but adding a partner leads to an inherently less scary experience for the exact same reason why watching a horror film is less scary with a friend by your side. The over-the-top action created a feeling of empowerment, not disempowerment, and the new checkpoint system, where items you pick up persist even through death, lowered the tension by removing any loss of progress. Resident Evil 4 walked a fine line between two different and not always conducive genres, but Resident Evil 5 increased the action side at the cost of the horror side, and in doing so, changed the identity of the series. It also lacked RE4's originality. By 2009, everyone was starting to combine action and horror. Yet, despite this neglect of what made Resident Evil, and notably lower review scores, RE5 still became the best-selling game in the series. This was the console generation of first and third-person shooter domination, and multiplayer widened the game's appeal, allowing RE5 to join the likes of Gears of War and Halo as solid action co-op experiences. But where does it leave a genre when the most iconic horror series of all is finding record success by turning away from horror? The years that followed provided the answer. Silent Hill would soon receive another entry, this time in series reimagining Shattered Memories from the same developer as Origins. Yet where Origins felt overly safe, Shattered Memories instead had the opposite problem, in that it changed too much, including removing combat and much of the gameplay entirely, in favor of atmospheric exploration and chase sequences. Shattered Memory did feature some ambitious story elements that incorporated player reactivity, but is still widely seen as a weak Silent Hill title. Meanwhile, EA would follow up Dead Space with a higher budget sequel in 2011, which followed the age-old tradition of exaggeration. Dead Space 2 tried to increase the intensity with a faster pace, more cinematic sequences, and improvements to the gameplay. This came at the cost of some of the first game's atmosphere and feeling of isolation, but in many ways, Dead Space 2 was successful, with just as strong reviews as its predecessor. For EA, however, it failed to meet sales expectations, despite the increased budget, leaving the future of the series somewhat uncertain. Fear would also experience problems, as after its second entry in 2009 failed to reach the same highs as the original, the third entry would seemingly follow in the footsteps of Resident Evil by increasing the focus on action and adding co-op, including going as far as to create a score system where players could compete against each other by completing challenges during gameplay. The end result was seen by many as disappointing, with design elements that were contrary to the goals of horror. In an interview years later, it was confirmed that the decision to add co-op was something mandated by publisher Warner mid-development. Developer Day One reportedly pushed back on this by saying that co-op isn't scary, but Warner apparently didn't care because co-op was a popular buzzword at the time. In 2012, Silent Hill would continue its unsuccessful streak with Downpour, which was intended to be a return to the series' survival horror roots, but suffered from weak execution, with technical issues and clunky combat receiving particular criticism. Still, it was Resident Evil itself that best represented horror's hopes and fears in this period, and it too would make a return to its survival horror route in Revelations, which released for the 3DS before coming to other systems a year later. Revelations was positively received, but was very much a spin-off title designed around the strengths and limitations of a handheld device. So for Resident Evil, the real test would be its next mainline entry, which arrived in late 2012 and failed. Resident Evil 6 was the worst reviewed game in the main series. Its sales were below Capcom's expectations, and it left the horror genre in crisis. 7 years earlier, action had seemed like the future, but even by Resident Evil 5, pushback against the loss of survival horror was obvious. Despite this, however, Resident Evil was more commercially successful than ever, having brought in action fans with 4 and then co-op fans in 5. So, in response to this divided fanbase, Resident Evil 6 tried to do everything and appeal to everyone. To do this, it featured 4 separate campaigns, each with a distinct style. Chris's campaign was a buddy military shooter, Leon's was a slower and more traditional horror experience, Jake's was a more cinematic and set-piece heavy action-adventure story, and Ada's featured a greater focus on stealth and puzzles. The end result was ambitious, but also disjointed and bloated. Leon's campaign was the most praised, but rather than satisfying fans of horror, as was its intent, it instead only served to highlight how lacking in horror most of the rest of the series had become by this point. And that was the game's most prevalent criticism, that Resident Evil 6 no longer felt like a horror game. Action was once novel, but novelty wears off, leaving an experience both failing to be scary because it was now familiar, and because horror was being sacrificed for action. And just 4 months after this, the other leading action horror series would also fail. Dead Space 3 was almost cancelled following the second game's underperforming sales. Instead, EA followed the same approach Warner did with Fear, and forced the developer to include certain features, including co-op and microtransactions, in an attempt to broaden the game's appeal and increase revenue. Alas, this did not work. Dead Space 3 disappointed critics, disappointed fans, and sold less than the previous entries, which would ultimately seal the fate of the series and its developer, Visceral Games. Dead Space 3 was still a competent action game, but its co-op would once more feel at odds with the objectives of horror, and its even greater focus on action and set pieces would once more disappoint horror fans. The genre's problems were also compounded in this period due to a complete lack of new titles. Some rare exceptions include Alan Wake in 2009, which channeled Twin Peaks and Stephen King to create an engaging narrative, yet was another game more focused on action, with developer Remedy describing the game as a psychological thriller rather than horror. Deadly Premonition in 2010, which somehow channeled Twin Peaks even harder, but is remembered more for its irreverent tone and oddball humour than its horror. And Ubisoft's ZombiU in 2012, which included a permadeath system where player characters become zombies on death and are replaced by a new survivor, as well as survival horror staples like inventory management and exploration. Yet, ZombiU's success was likely limited by the Wii U's small user base, leading to its sequel being cancelled. Most new horror titles, however, were simply critically panned and instantly forgotten, with the genre laying claim to several of the lowest Metacritic scores of the generation. And so, with no new blood coming through, and almost every existing horror series struggling, the genre seemed to be in crisis. And yet, for fans of horror, there was still reason to hope, as 2014 promised to be the year survival horror made its comeback, with not 1, but 3 big new titles. The first was Alien Isolation, which after decades of official and unofficial Alien games, was the first horror-focused take on the franchise in years. Isolation took full advantage of the next-gen hardware to recreate the retro sci-fi aesthetic of the original film with painstaking accuracy. Its first-person perspective emphasized atmosphere and immersion, and its gameplay marked a return to disempowerment, with stealth vastly more useful than combat, and the player needing to run, hide, and use a variety of scavenged tools to have any hope of survival. Isolation is best known for its iconic alien, who hunted the player relentlessly, patrolling environments and tracking them via sound to unexpectedly pop out of vents or ceiling ducts, ensuring nowhere felt safe. The alien could be slowed but never killed, ensuring the player always felt like prey, and was governed via a groundbreaking AI system that led to varied, unscripted encounters designed to be different each attempt to prevent familiarity. It could even learn from the player, with more complicated behaviors unlocking over the course of the game and adapting to players' actions, helping the alien to not fall for the same tricks too many times. And so, Alien Isolation was a triumph of horror game design and was praised by many as the scariest game in years. And yet, somehow, that wasn't enough. Reviews were more mixed than expected, including a now infamous 5.9 from IGN, with criticism mostly centered on its long length, repetition, and difficulty. Its sales would also fall below Sega's expectations, which raised the question of if a horror game of this quality wasn't enough to be successful, then what is? One possible answer would be a new title directed by horror's most famous game designer. Shinji Mikami was responsible for the two most influential, and to some, the two greatest horror games ever made. But after Resident Evil 4, Mikami left Capcom to ultimately found his own studio, Tango Gameworks, whose first game released the very same month as Alien Isolation, and saw Mikami return to the role of director. The Evil Within seemed to be exactly what survival horror fans had spent years longing for, with Mikami even saying his motivation for returning to horror was that everything had become focused on action now, and that he wanted to bring back true survival horror. With The Evil Within, he had complete creative freedom to do this, and the result was in many ways faithful to survival horror of old. The Evil Within saw a return to resource management, manual saving via safe rooms, exploration, puzzles, and a slower pace than other action horror games of the time. Its camera would copy the more modern over-the-shoulder approach popularized by RE4, but still stuck close to the player to limit their view, with movement heavily slowed when aiming. And yet, in other ways, The Evil Within felt decidedly modern, with plenty of slow-walking segments or scripted set pieces very representative of AAA gaming in 2014. Ultimately, The Evil Within was seen as a solid attempt at modernizing classic survival horror that risked being too old school for some and too contemporary for others. Its reception was positive, but it wasn't the horror savior to kickstart the genre that some had hoped for. Which leaves 2014's final prospect. PT came out of nowhere, releasing as a free demo on the PlayStation Network one day in August, in what might be one of the greatest pieces of gaming marketing there's ever been. The demo itself was simple. One hallway, repeating seemingly endlessly, with the only gameplay being walking and looking. As the player progressed, this hallway changed. Lights dimmed, doorways opened or closed, reality unraveled, and it became apparent that you are not in here alone.
Several days before the murders, look behind you. I said, look behind you. Like he was chanting some strange spell. There was another family.
PT was a masterclass in atmosphere and suspense. The first-person view and photorealism immersed players. The short length kept its scares fresh and effective, and the mystery surrounding the demo and the mysteries contained within it created a viral marketing sensation as players raced to figure out what PT actually was. The answer didn't take long to arrive. I mean, the internet has seen far more cryptic ARGs than this, And PT wasn't meant to be unsolvable, it simply wanted to tease. After fulfilling a range of cryptic criteria, PT, or Playable Teaser, ends with the player finally escaping their purgatory and stepping out into the town as the camera pulled back to show actor Norman Reedus and the planned game's real title, Silent Hills. Reedus wasn't the only big name attached to the project either. The reboot was headed by gaming auteur Hideo Kojima, Academy Award-winning director Guillermo del Toro was co-directing, and even celebrated horror mangaka Junji Ito was in talks to provide monster designs. Silent Hills seemingly had everything needed to be the biggest thing to happen to horror since RE4. A proven effectiveness in scaring players, as shown in PT, the budget and experience of a gaming powerhouse in Kojima and Konami, star power to pull in audiences from other mediums thanks to Reedus, Del Toro, and Ito, and more hype than a horror game could dream of thanks to its demo, and this was all before the marketing even officially began. The fact that this came at a time when many begrudged the loss of horror in horror games, and that many found PT to be genuinely terrifying, made this game seem like some destined savior of the genre. The perfect game sent at the perfect time to make all wrongs finally right. And then, 8 months later, it was cancelled. Konami and Kojima clashed during the completion of Metal Gear Solid 5, with Silent Hills becoming a notable casualty. And so it was that horror's savior died, and with barely a whimper, dooming the genre forevermore. Except, that's not what happened at all. In fact, by 2015, horror wasn't struggling, it was positively soaring, reaching larger audiences than ever previously, and with more new titles than at any other time, as accepted beliefs around both survival horror and action horror came to be questioned and rewritten. And if anything, PT wasn't a response to action horror's failings, but simply a part of this new, more dominant wave. If horror's greatest problem is familiarity, indie games provide a solution. But pinpointing exactly where indie horror begins isn't easy. For many years, there was little delineation between mainstream gaming and indie gaming, with PC games often being independent by default. This means many of the earlier games in this video could technically meet a definition of being indie. Still, for the most part, indie game has come to be used as a label to differentiate smaller, lower-budget games in a modern era dominated by high-budget ones. The first horror games to meet this criteria were made in RPG Maker, a game development tool that dates back to the early 90s. Like Corpse Party, a horror adventure game originally released in 1996 for the PC 98, made by 22-year-old college student Makoto Kedwin. 10 years later, Corpse Party received a remake for mobile phones, which later got enhanced and released on PC in 2008, before an English PSP version in 2011 finally brought it international attention, and then additional remakes, re-releases, and sequels expanded its reach even further. Corpse Party featured a group of students staying behind after class who get transported to a nightmare version of the school, haunted by the ghost of a child murdered there. Its gameplay was reminiscent of older JRPGs, with 2D sprites, a top-down perspective, and even JRPG-style battles, although these were removed in future versions. This is accompanied by exploration, puzzle-solving, and visual novel-style dialogue. Corpse Party's initial popularity was likely helped by its subversion of JRPG conventions, as instead of the carefree, uplifting adventure of other games in the genre, it was graphically violent and deliberately disturbing, with its cute anime visuals hiding an unexpected brutality. Meanwhile, Corpse Party's later popularity owed much to its story and lore, which needed to be pieced together by players and generated much discussion online. Basically, it was a game for the social media age of fan theories and lore videos, even if it actually predated this era by several years. This also helps explain the popularity of other early RPG Maker hits, like Yume Nikki, the surreal freeware walking sim that first released in 2004 and received an English fan translation around 2008. Yume Nikki was a game about exploration, with no combat, dialogue, or game overs. Instead, the player journeys through various dreamlike worlds, many of which contain no horror elements whatsoever. And yet Yume Nikki was undeniably disturbing, in part because its lack of enemies or objectives was so unlike other games of its era. Yume Nikki wasn't simply weird in its imagery, it broke the rules of what games were expected to be, and let players search for meaning by themselves, with most hints that could be found suggesting these dreams hid something disturbing. Yet, RPG Maker horror could also be direct. Ao Oni released in 2008 and found great popularity on Japanese internet before receiving an English fan translation soon after. The premise of the game was simple. A group of high school students explore an abandoned mansion only to be locked inside with a purple Oni who chases them, transforming them into Onis if caught. The horror was equally simple and owed much to how the Oni appears at unscripted moments to create tense, unpredictable chase sequences. All three of these games took different approaches to horror, yet shared a contrast between their minimal, often innocent visual design and darker subject matter, and use of limited graphics to invoke the player's imagination. In the West, however, indie horror would find success through very different reasons. In 2006, two inexperienced game developers named Jens Nilsson and Thomas Grip created a tech demo for an annual student game dev competition in Sweden. The judges were unimpressed with their entry, but when the demo was released for free online, other gamers had a rather different reaction. This demo was called Penumbra, and less than 1 year later, after substantial changes, it would become Frictional Games' debut title. Penumbra Overture was made by a core team of just 3 people, with 9 others providing additional help. The game followed a physicist who gets stuck in an abandoned mine in Greenland, and this setting played an important role. Unnerving isolation is at the heart of Penumbra, but this wouldn't have been possible if not for how immersive the experience was. Frictional might not have been able to compete with AAA games in pure graphics, but the first-person perspective, lack of a HUD, interactive world, and realistically modeled physics system all worked to pull players into the desolate surroundings. Gameplay was reminiscent of classic adventure games, with an emphasis on puzzle solving and atmospheric exploration, and while combat was included, the player was generally ineffective and incentivized to avoid enemies to create a feeling of disempowerment. Overture was praised for its unsettling atmosphere and would be followed by the even more effective Penumbra Black Plague 1 year later, but it was Frictional's next game that would truly change horror. It was in this period that indie games were emerging as a distinct part of gaming thanks to digital distribution platforms like Steam and Xbox Live Arcade, which meant that smaller titles didn't need to compete for physical shelf space in retail stores. This helped create an interest in shorter, more subversive, or just more artistic games from developers. For example, 2009's The Path was a twisted retelling of Little Red Riding Hood that explored the loss of innocence in growing up and featured no traditional gameplay, being described as an anti-game or art game by reviewers. Downfall from Harvester Games would bring back point-and-click adventure gameplay alongside a psychologically heavy narrative of a man's descent into madness, and Aversion would provide one of the first examples of a game hiding horror elements underneath a completely different style of visuals and gameplay, as the cartoonish platformer about rescuing a princess slowly unraveled into something more disturbing. Still, the reason indie games conquered horror wasn't just because of the rise of digital distribution, as was the case for most other indie genres, but rather something else. In 2010, Frictional Games released Amnesia: The Dark Descent to strong reviews. Amnesia made a return to Penumbra's immersive first-person exploration, but removed combat entirely, leaving the player completely helpless if caught. Despite this, Amnesia still retained a focus on gameplay through the introduction of a sanity meter, where sanity was lost through spending time in darkness or witnessing monsters or other unsettling events, and makes you increasingly vulnerable as it gets lower. This intensified the resource management, as not having enough light sources would lead to a loss of sanity, in addition to having to navigate in the dark. It also incentivized players to avoid looking at enemies as much as possible, which helped preserve the fear of the unknown, making it feel even scarier. Most of all though, the sanity meter gave the player greater agency, leading to tension and stress that heightened the horror. Just like how Resident Evil 1 makes it the player's responsibility when to use ink ribbons to save their progress, Amnesia forced players to weigh the risks between its two core systems. Do you light torches to preserve sanity but risk running out of tinderboxes later, or should you stay in the darkness and risk your sanity? Should you use your lamp even if there's a risk you might be seen by an enemy, and just how much sanity are you willing to lose hiding in the darkness when an enemy is out there patrolling? Amnesia never let you feel safe, but unlike in so many other horror games, it also understood how to be patient. It takes several hours before the player is ever actually in danger in Amnesia, and yet the build-up to the first enemy encounters was agonizing. Monsters are glimpsed in the briefest moments, menacing sounds are heard waiting for you in the distance, and the narrative of a man who has deliberately drunk an amnesia potion to escape something only hinted at leaves you without the comfort of even knowing what might be out there. And still, Amnesia forces you to wait, almost lulling you into a false sense of security that maybe the game only wants to tease, until you hear that siren for the first time. Amnesia remains a masterclass in suspense and pure terror. In a time when mainstream horror games had little actual horror and were empowering players with slick action and fun spectacle, Amnesia gave players the exact opposite. Multiple reviews praised it as the scariest game ever made, and yet its sales started slow. In fact, in a blog post 1 week after its release, Frictional Games expressed concern over their future and said that despite the better-than-expected reviews, sales were only in line with their more modest expectations. But, unlike with most games, Amnesia's sales didn't slow down over time, thanks largely to this, what you are doing right now.
Leaving.
I'm so scared.
I'm leaving. Oh!
Fuck.
Amnesia's suspenseful horror was perfect for creating singular moments of pure panic, perfect for creating exaggerated reactions that could be forever immortalized in YouTube Let's Plays and React compilations. Together, these videos would get tens of millions of views at a time when YouTube was still in its infancy, kicking off a symbiotic relationship between indie horror games and content creation that is still going strong to this day. It's not hard to imagine what the appeal of this content might be. Reactions like this are entertaining, but horror videos also circumvent one of horror's downsides. A big part of the appeal of horror is that it gives you a feeling of fear with the reality of safety. They allow people to enjoy the thrills of a dangerous or scary situation without actually being in any danger. A horror-based YouTube video can do the same, with one extra layer of removal by letting you watch rather than play to provide an even safer way to experience a game like Amnesia. perfect for people that find the scariest game ever made to be maybe a little too scary. Just like how some people might prefer to watch a scary movie alongside a friend because otherwise they find it too scary. Regardless, Amnesia: The Dark Descent had a substantial impact on all of horror gaming. It proved horror games could be critically and commercially successful without combat, but horror didn't need the biggest budgets to be scary, and that there was still a market for scary games, even if action horror was dominating the mainstream, and maybe because action horror was so dominant. And with time, Amnesia would be just one of many internet-fueled success stories. To understand the role of the internet on horror, there might be no better example than Slender: The 8 Pages. Released in 2012 and based on a popular creepypasta that dates back to 2009, Slender: The 8 Pages was a simple first-person game where you collect pages in a forest at night while avoiding the eponymous Slender Man. Slender would also find much success on YouTube, and would even be important in creating the soon-to-be biggest YouTuber in the world.
This is like the first viral kind of thing I had, which was that I found this game called Slender on my broarmy.net forum. Someone posted it. I double-checked on YouTube. Has anyone else played this? Nothing. No one. And I was like, this is gonna be amazing. Yeah, this is my first viral hit. I was so proud.
Yet, there was one important difference between Slender and Amnesia, which is that unlike Amnesia, Slender was not a good game. With a runtime of under 30 minutes, no real strategy to the gameplay other than trial and error and memorizing page locations, and no depth to the horror or narrative, it's hard to defend this game. Its strength was how it took advantage of something already popular on the internet, and its ability to create jump scares.
Whoa. Whoa! What the hell is this?
This was enough to generate an exaggerated reaction, which was enough to create a popular YouTube video. I mean, who cares if a game is only 30 minutes long in an era where YouTube videos themselves only lasted about 10 minutes? And who cares if there was no gameplay when most people experiencing it aren't playing? This was the downside of YouTube. The internet allowed many great games to be discovered and reach the success they deserve, but not every success did deserve it, and many low-quality, cheaply produced titles popped up over the years to try to cash in on this craze through trying to go viral rather than trying to create a good game. This proliferation of lower quality games risked giving the higher quality ones a bad reputation through association, something which may even have happened in time with Amnesia: The Dark Descent. But there was more to indie horror than just let's play fodder, and by 2012, that was starting to be obvious. For example, modding communities had been making horror games for years, and they were finally starting to get more mainstream recognition, as can be seen with Half-Life 2 mod Grey or Gold Source mod Cry of Fear. Cry of Fear was particularly successful, taking heavy influence from Silent Hill in its audio and enemy design, as well as some not-so-subtle homages, and combining this with tense first-person shooting and urban exploration. Its story featured a young man waking up in the city of Stockholm to find it infested with monsters, and tackled themes of mental illness and trauma. Meanwhile, solo dev Jasper Burns' Lone Survivor would make a return to the classic survival horror gameplay of slow exploration, resource management, and puzzle solving, alongside retro-inspired 2D visuals. Burns' inspiration was a desire to revive the survival horror genre that he saw as having disappeared, and Lone Survivor would mark the start of something of a retro revival. 2012 would also bring a new wave of RPG Maker horror games, in what's now seen as a golden age for the subgenre, with examples like Mad Father, The Witch's House, and Ib? Okay, I never looked up how to pronounce that game. We're going to go for Ib, which all received praise for their strong stories. In 2013, indie horror would see another mainstream success in Outlast, a game clearly influenced by Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and successful for many of the same reasons. Outlast was a creative take on the found footage genre of horror films, except with the player cast as the one doing the filming. In it, a journalist investigates a remote psychiatric hospital only to find it's been overtaken by its dangerous inhabitants, who they then become trapped inside with. A camcorder acted as the player's night vision, with batteries needing to be scavenged as you explore, but Outlast gameplay remained simple, with no combat and a need to run, hide, and avoid enemies instead. These stealth sections could sometimes overstay their welcome, and the player will probably find themselves captured so many times that the horror of this becomes noticeably less effective. But Outlast's real achievement was its relentless cruelty. For example, in one early sequence, the player finds themselves fleeing from a group of inmates, only to be rescued at the last second by a mysterious stranger, who then knocks you unconscious, straps you into a wheelchair, takes you to the asylum's exit, the very place you've been trying to reach, tells you you're free to leave if you want to, before wheeling you away for some surgery that I don't think I can show on YouTube. A lot of horror games enjoy stabbing players with a knife, but Outlast took glee in twisting that knife around and then sticking a finger inside the wound while asking with mock concern if that stung. The result was undeniably crude, but it was also effective, and further showed why indie horror could be successful in this era where mainstream horror was struggling. The extreme lengths Outlast was willing to go to was exactly the type of thing mainstream gaming wouldn't do for fear of alienating audiences. But Outlast wasn't trying to be for everyone, and its unrivaled brutality helped it to stand out and get attention in the social media age where attention was everything. And speaking of social media, 2014 would show just how important it had grown to be. Scott Cawthon had made around 80 games before creating the one which made him famous. The idea for the game was born out of criticism for his earlier work, which some found unintentionally terrifying. And so in response, he decided instead to make something intentionally terrifying. Five Nights at Freddy's released in August 2014 and featured simple point-and-click gameplay about watching security cameras in a Chuck E. Cheese-inspired pizzeria during the night shift. Within the pizzeria were several wandering homicidal animatronics, which players had to avoid by locking the doors to the security office if they got close. The challenge in this came from having limited power, with watching cameras, turning on lights, and locking doors, all expending this resource. Therefore, players had to save enough power to make it through the night, but spend enough power to work out when an animatronic is nearby so they could lock the door in time. The price of failure was a jump scare. As jump scares are regularly criticized in horror games, it might be tempting to dismiss Five Nights at Freddy's as just another low-budget viral wannabe, and it certainly was low-budget, but there are reasons why FNAF succeeded where other games didn't. For one thing, its jump scares were in many ways the opposite of cheap. In most games, the punishment for failure is a loss of progress. FNAF instead used jump scares to punish the player, but this only happened if you failed, and rather than coming out of nowhere, the entire experience was instead designed around making players anticipate this moment and deriving dread from knowing that it might be coming. Still, there's no denying that FNAF's jump scares helped it to succeed on YouTube, and my god did this game succeed on YouTube. Five Nights at Freddy's didn't gain the millions of views of Amnesia in 2010, or the tens of millions of Slender in 2012, but rather hundreds of millions.
Yeah, I always wondered what was in all those empty heads back there. You know. Thank you! This is probably the scariest game I've ever played. I've never felt such paranoia. In a sense, it's not even a sense of dread anymore. It's just, I know I'm gonna die, and I don't know when it's gonna happen. That's the kind of feeling I got.
The first video from YouTuber Markiplier has 124 million views. Multiple highly successful careers were launched by this game, And in time, FNAF would transform into a massive media franchise, with numerous sequels, a highly profitable film, and more films planned for the future. Five Nights at Freddy's was made by one man with no experience with horror in just 6 months, and yet its creepy animatronics resonated with younger audiences, and in time it became one of horror games' largest success stories. Few other titles show the massive importance of the internet for indie games so clearly, or show how dominant indie horror had become. And yet the genre was also impressively varied, which other games that same year show. For example, Darkwood would use an unusual top-down perspective, with a limited field of view that only showed the player what your character could actually see. This helped create an atmosphere of dread and paranoia, something only heightened by the day-night cycle that forced players to hunker down in their hideout every night and pray that whatever horror lurks outside leaves you alone. Darkwood's gameplay took inspiration from recent, not horror survival games, with an emphasis on exploring a large open world and scavenging materials, and even its twisted arboreal setting felt highly distinct. Or, for a different type of forest, there was The Forest, a single or cooperative horror survival game that also released in early access that year. The Forest featured even more modern survival mechanics, as well as a large number of cannibalistic mutants, and some of the scariest cave sequences that had ever been seen in a game. The sandbox nature of the survival genre helped The Forest to create a genuinely unpredictable experience, where moments of tension and desperation could occur unscripted. Other indie games could be refreshingly experimental. 2015's Monstrum would take the traditional survival horror foundation of older games and combine it with roguelike systems, including procedurally generated levels and permadeath. This combination addressed the problem of gameplay becoming familiar and thus ineffective at creating fear and tension. Admittedly, Monstrum was unsuccessful in other ways, with repetition brought by permadeath being a downside, but this was still the type of experimentation that felt so absent from mainstream horror since Resident Evil 4. 2015 would also bring the release of Frictional's next game, Soma. Set in an underwater research facility 100 years in the future, Soma never came close to matching The Dark Descent when it came to sheer terror, yet it made up for this with its stronger story. Exploring themes of consciousness, identity, and mortality, Soma's existential horror was deeply unsettling, hugely memorable, and further showed the strength of indie horror as a means to tell creative stories. By 2016, the indie scene had had enough time to respond to the cancellation of Silent Hills. PT's successors could almost be their own subgenre at this point, but Layers of Fear was one of the first. In it, the player took the role of a disturbed painter trying to complete his magnum opus as they explored a changing house in first person and uncovered the events that preceded this. The faster turnaround of indie games meant they could more easily chase trends like this, but other indie games would resolutely stick to doing their own thing. In addition to Steam, itch.io would become a trove of creative independent projects, and horror has always been one of the most popular tags. One of the best known of these is Anatomy from Kitty Horror Show, which provided a unique take on the age-old haunted house trope. In it, players explored an empty suburban home, collecting audio tapes that offered metaphors and hints about this setting, as your surroundings seemed to slowly change and evolve in unsettling ways. Kitty Horror Show's work uses lo-fi aesthetics to conjure mixed feelings of familiarity and unease, and they are just one of many creators who have found success on the independent marketplace. Still, by 2017, indie games had truly cemented themselves as a dominant force within gaming, and the range and depth of experiences they offered allowed them to cater to many different players. 2017 alone would see games like Detention, a distinctly Taiwanese game about history and tragedy, Little Nightmares, a surreal yet polished puzzle platformer, Bendy and the Ink Machine, a creative take on twisted nostalgia, Doki Doki Literature Club, a subversive and shocking visual novel, and Chapter 1 of Faith, an 8-bit survival horror game that proved the genre could work even on an Atari, with the right design. The level of success of different games has obviously varied, but the cultural reach of the most successful arguably matches anything seen in the rest of gaming, and indie horror has continued to shape the genre ever since. If familiarity is horror's greatest problem, indie games provide a solution. The experiences they offer can be incredibly varied, bringing constant unfamiliarity, and as soon as one series, setting, antagonist, or gameplay type starts to feel expected and overused, new titles can arrive to offer new experiences that the greater discoverability of the internet can allow to find a sizable audience, even with minimal marketing. Many of the other disadvantages that lower budget games bring can also work in horror's favour. Low quality graphics can be eerily uncanny while leaving more to the player's imagination. Short runtimes can naturally prevent the horror from getting stale. Being able to feature little gameplay can allow for a greater emphasis on immersion or narrative while allowing for completely different types of experiences. And not needing to cater to large mainstream audiences can liberate games to be weirder, crueler, and more experimental while still being able to succeed. Indie games have so many answers to horror's problems, which their continued success reflects. But while mainstream horror might have taken a beating in the 2010s, there was one series that should never be ruled out. Following Resident Evil's struggles and PET's cancellation, the future of horror seemed uncertain. Yet new games continued to release, as the grip of action finally loosened. In 2015, Supermassive Games' Until Dawn would resurrect the interactive movie format that had once showed such promise 20 years earlier. Until Dawn combined narrative choices with quick-time event-filled action sequences to create unpredictable outcomes for its group of teenagers whose getaway to a remote mountain lodge goes disastrously wrong. Through this, the game would replicate the thrills of classic 80s slasher films, creating tension over who lives and who dies, while also raising the stakes significantly higher than in most other choices matter type games. Until Dawn also benefited from high production values, with impressive facial capture and well-known actors, and its interactive movie format was made much fresher by the many years since it was last attempted. Ultimately, Until Dawn exceeded Sony's expectations, and led to several similar games in the years that followed. Not every game was this successful, however. 2016's Nightcry might be one of horror's greatest failures. Nightcry was kickstarted in early 2015 as a successor to Clock Tower from Clock Tower's creator, Hifumi Kono, and the director of The Grudge, Takashi Shimizu. Other big horror names were also attached to the project, including Silent Hill art director Masahiro Ito. In fact, the Kickstarter page seems to feature just about every famed Japanese horror developer, with the likes of Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami and Silent Hill creator Keiichiro Toyama showing up to tell everyone what a great game Nightcry will be. Turns out, they were wrong. Nightcry was faithful to its inspiration, including copying its point-and-click gameplay and Scissorman-like pursuer, yet reviews lambasted it for its poor controls, weak presentation, and excess of bugs. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, Dead by Daylight also released that year, and has since become the highest-selling horror game ever made. Dead by Daylight was not the first asymmetrical multiplayer game, or even the first asymmetrical horror game, as a similar idea was seen in Left 4 Dead. Yet it did popularize the concept, and to great success. Matches involve 4 survivors trying to escape from one killer by completing a number of tasks, while the killer attempts to pick them off one by one, sticking them on meat hooks to be sacrificed to an even greater evil. In this way, Dead by Daylight was a distillation of many horror movies' most exciting moments, where tension over being caught hangs over every action and decision. Its pursuer also solved the problem of AI growing predictable and familiar by casting that role to the least predictable intelligence of all: other people. In time, it would also benefit from a near-endless list of DLC introducing other licensed villains, making it a bit like Super Smash Bros. For serial killers. The other major event that year was a trailer from Capcom for a very different-looking horror game to what the studio was then known for. In fact, it was so different, people didn't even realize what it was.
Condemned is a great guess. Yeah. No. Nope. Never. Seven silent.
Resident Evil 7 released in January 2017 and brought the horror back to gaming's most famous horror series. When comparing 7 to what came before, it seems obvious that it was influenced by the success of indie games like Amnesia and Outlast, as well as the game that never was, PT. RE7 changed to a more immersive first-person perspective, it emphasized the protagonist's vulnerability with unkillable antagonists, and it freed itself from the series' narrative baggage to tell a more grounded and chilling story. Resident Evil 7 basically learned from the horror games that did work in the 2010s, and yet, unlike many of those games, it also had something they didn't: strong gameplay that could support a full-length game. RE7 returned to the slow exploration, resource management, and puzzle solving of the series' roots to create a genuinely modern take on classic survival horror that could still be enjoyed by modern players thanks to its first-person action combat. As a result, it's hard not to see Resident Evil 7 as a culmination of the entire genre up until this point. It took the gameplay foundation from the original Resident Evil, the mass appeal action combat from later RE games, the tension and narrative intrigue of PT, and the importance of disempowerment and horror that committed to being scary from smash indie hits. And its reward for all this was strong reviews, strong sales, and a renewed belief in the Resident Evil series and in mainstream horror in general. The Evil Within 2 also released that year, and while it may have lacked the dramatic impact of RE7, it still made numerous improvements on the original and helped restore confidence in horror's future. And the following years would only provide more reasons to feel optimistic. In early 2019, Resident Evil continued its winning streak with a remake of Resident Evil 2. Announced back in 2015, the remake would use the same engine as 7, but with a third-person camera that preserved the visual style of the original game, alongside a modern control scheme. Yet, despite this perspective difference, the remake stuck closely to the philosophy that made RE7 such a success. The gameplay was a reimagining of classic survival horror, the combat appealed to modern audiences, and the horror was emphasized rather than neglected, with a strong focus on atmosphere and even some changes to the original game, like an earlier arrival of Mr. X to create deliberate unfamiliarity for series veterans. Resident Evil 2's critical and commercial reception was even more positive than 7's, with it eventually becoming the best-selling game in the series. And so, like the remake of Resident Evil 1 so many years earlier, Resident Evil 2 set a new gold standard for what a remake should be that all future games would be measured against, including the remake of Resident Evil 3, which released 1 year later and was found somewhat wanting. But as the new decade began, it was hard not to imagine a bright future. Indie games continued to find success through innovation, as can be seen by Phasmophobia, which was created by a single developer and has since passed 22 million in total sales. In Phasmophobia, teams of 4 players investigate paranormal activity in various locations to identify the cause of hauntings. Its most unique feature was its use of speech recognition, where players could communicate with each other based on proximity or walkie-talkies, but where the game would also understand key words players said, with ghosts potentially reacting to this, triggering certain events or attempts to communicate back. This idea was highly novel, and the cooperative nature helped create emergent, unscripted moments of tension, success, and failure. And as with other indie hits before it, Phasmophobia's success was also helped by popularity on Twitch and YouTube. 2020 would also bring the release of Visage, a game directly inspired by PT that was kickstarted after the cancellation of Silent Hills and did an admirable job of capturing the former's sense of psychological despair as you explored another nightmarish house in first person. Then, in 2021, Resident Evil continued strong with Village, the 8th mainline installment, which continued the first-person continuity of 7. How do you make a successful horror sequel? Well, Village's answer was to do the same thing that's worked so many times previously, to one-up what came before. Resident Evil Village was more exaggerated, with more ridiculous villains, more spectacle-heavy boss fights, and a higher intensity to the action. The result was a less scary game, but to be fair, Resident Evil has always been about more than just horror. There is a camp, self-aware desire to have fun with horror that runs throughout this entire series, which makes Village seem like a natural progression. Resident Evil's 8th game simply repeats the same trend seen in 2 and 3 compared to 1, or 5 and 6 compared to 4. And maybe that's okay, because a series that has reinvented itself before can reinvent itself again the next time it needs to go back to its horror roots. Retro survival horror had also become more prevalent by 2021, with games like Tormented Souls or Alyssa both offering the fixed camera angles and optional tank controls that were missing from even Resident Evil's modern titles. The impact of these retro revival games might be small compared to some indie hits, but they've still been able to find a dedicated audience amidst the modern gaming landscape, which has ensured new titles have continued to release since. 2022's Signalis in particular received much acclaim for its strong aesthetics and memorable story about Orwellian dystopia, cosmic horror, and love. Yet, indie horror is also still dominated by viral sensations. 2022 brought a sudden surge of interest in liminal horror, particularly around the Backrooms, a large extra-dimensional expanse of empty rooms popularized by creepypastas and 4chan's Xboard. In response, a number of hastily developed games appeared, the best known being Escape the Backrooms, a cooperative exploration-based game that tried to capture the dreary ambience and unsettling vibe of its inspiration. Still, if there's one thing the horror genre hasn't managed in recent years, it's creating new, successful, higher-budget titles. 2022's The Callisto Protocol is a good example. Positioned as a spiritual successor to Dead Space, and directed by the former's creator, Glenn Schofield, The Callisto Protocol set audience expectations high with polished trailers and plenty of Dead Space callbacks. The final game, however, was criticized for its weak story, poor technical performance, and simplistic combat lacking in enemy variety. Unsurprisingly, sales did not meet expectations. Disappointment over the Callisto Protocol was deepened by how long fans had been waiting for a Dead Space successor, and yet, by some strange twist of fate, a remake for the original Dead Space would release just 2 months later. Dead Space 2023 likely owes its existence to the success of Capcom's Resident Evil remakes, and yet it didn't quite represent such a drastic change to its source material, given that Dead Space's 2008 action gameplay still felt relatively modern. As a result, the Dead Space remake was a faithful recreation that made small tweaks to story and gameplay, and was well received by fans and critics. This didn't appear to be enough, however, as while developer Motive explored ideas of both a remake to Dead Space 2 and a new original entry into the series, publisher EA reportedly refused to greenlight further titles due to the remake's disappointing sales. This suggests big-budget horror games are still struggling to achieve consistent mainstream appeal, and yet 2023 continued to be a strong year for the genre. Capcom extended their run of remakes with Resident Evil 4, which became their highest reviewed game since Resident Evil 4. The remake stuck closely to the style of the previous remakes, expanding some of the features of the original game, like by adding stealth kills and the ability to parry, while maintaining a slightly darker and more serious tone. 2023 would also bring a successful follow-up to Amnesia from Frictional Games in The Bunker, which took inspiration from immersive sims to deepen player agency, ratcheting up the stressful decision-making to even greater levels as the player explored a single open bunker during World War I while being hunted by an unkillable monster. Co-op horror would also receive another smash hit in Lethal Company, which willingly embraced the often absurd and humorous nature of horror with friends in a game about exploring procedurally generated moons to collect scrap. Lethal Company is another example of a single solo developer having a huge impact, and again shows the importance of social media on viral success. Meanwhile, indie innovation would continue with the new emergence of anomaly hunting games, a trend which dates back to at least I'm on Observation Duty in 2018, but which started to find more popularity with games like The Exit 8 in late 2023. Anomaly hunting feeds off horror's ability to generate paranoia in players, although it has yet to be successfully expanded into a gameplay system with more depth than a spot the difference puzzle. Alan Wake 2 would also release that year to give mainstream horror another highly acclaimed entry that struggled to back up its strong critical success with similar sales. Alan Wake 2 featured a stronger horror focus than its predecessor, and impressed with its creativity and originality. And yet it would raise further questions about horror's viability for big-budget titles. When poorly received games sell poorly, it's expected. When highly reviewed games do the same, it suggests that there might be a deeper problem. Finally, 2024 would produce much of the same. Alone in the Dark would get another unsuccessful reboot after its long hiatus. Retro horror would continue strong with Crow Country. Indie hits like Mouthwashing and My Side would further show the importance of social media on success. And Silent Hill would join in on the remake trend with Blooper Team's Silent Hill 2, a game which turned out far better than many expected given the challenge of remaking such a beloved classic. Silent Hill 2's remake would again adopt a third-person, over-the-shoulder control scheme while remaining faithful to the original story, and after years of unsuccessful Western Silent Hill games, followed by years of silence or worse, its success has been the best thing to happen to the series in a very long time. And so, horror is officially back. Just as long as it's a remake of a game people already love that uses the exact same gameplay as every other modern hit. Otherwise, success seems less certain. But there are still reasons to be hopeful. And reasons to worry, because the future of horror is genuinely unknown, just like it always has been. If you want to understand the entire history of horror games, you need to understand the importance of familiarity. It took many years for developers to work out how to create gameplay that works with horror rather than against it. Gameplay inherently leads to familiarity, which inherently harms horror. It took the breaking of established rules to overcome this problem, with player vision being restricted, protagonists being disempowered, and consequences for failure being heightened, all to create tension, dread, and vulnerability. Resident Evil 1 then took this to a new level, and was rewarded with staggering success, which enshrined survival horror as its own distinct genre ever since, and led to numerous sequels, successors, and copycats. And it was this success which became its downfall. Ideas that were once new became old, things that were fresh became stale, and the unknown became familiar, as horror lost its edge. And so the genre was forced to change, with Resident Evil 4 leading the way and taking much of the acclaim and much of the blame for this shift towards action. This change solved the problem of familiarity, but the objectives of action often work against those of horror, and so as soon as the novelty of new cameras and combo systems wore off, horror once more faced the same issue, but this time with even shakier horror foundations. At the same time as this, indie games emerged to provide a near-endless source of innovation, originality, and social media content, bringing horror to ever greater audiences and lifting up both the deserving and sometimes undeserving. But as indie horror flourished, mainstream horror languished, until Resident Evil once more tackled the problem of familiarity by reinventing itself to go back to its roots, while learning from what did work in the modern horror landscape. Since then, Resident Evil has continued to find success, but other big-budget horror games have struggled to replicate this, leaving the future of the genre uncertain. Outside of horror, modern gaming is increasingly dominated by recognizable IPs, sequels, and remakes, as ever-growing gaming budgets force the industry to avoid risks by chasing trends and sticking to what's proven to work. Yet for horror, this approach doesn't guarantee the same safety. The more horror stays the same, the less effective it becomes, and the fact that the only big-budget games being regularly made are coming from the exact same series, using the exact same gameplay, and often even being remakes of the exact same games, feels like a warning for the future. But there is still room for developer creativity, and if mainstream horror does seem destined to face the same problem of familiarity all over again, it can also just reinvent itself again, all while indie horror can continue to experiment and pick up any creative slack. The future of horror is uncertain. The genre has now grown so wide that fans of one type of horror game aren't necessarily fans of others. There is a fracturing between gameplay-heavy experiences versus gameplay light, retro design versus modern, multiplayer versus single, humorous versus serious, action versus disempowerment. The genre is far from unified, and there is no obvious answer to what mainstream horror should be. But the diversity the genre now provides seems like one of its greatest assets. Different people may prefer different things, but horror arguably needs these differences. Horror can't survive if it becomes too familiar. This is why making a horror game is so challenging. And this is a challenge that I feel doesn't always get enough appreciation. Society has a tendency to undervalue and look down on horror. It's historically been rare for horror movies or books to receive much critical acclaim, even for some of the very best. And this has sometimes continued into the realm of video games. The Game Awards, for example, has many categories and recognizes many specific genres, but horror isn't one of them despite its suitability. Meanwhile, indie horror risks being written off as being all about cheap jump scares, crude gore, or dumb internet content. And yet, horror is a genre which takes full advantage of the unique qualities of the medium. Horror games provide experiences you can't find anywhere else, and the genre has a long history of innovation, creativity, and risk-taking that I think is worth remembering. Thank you for watching. If you want to support these videos, you can do so on Patreon. Videos like this take a lot of time and involve a lot of research, which is all done by me alone, so I appreciate the assistance and financial security generous viewers provide. Otherwise, I might be streaming a bit on YouTube in a couple days, probably some horror game, so if you want to hear me talk about horror games even more, then you've probably already missed your chance, because most views on these videos come after the first couple days. But oh well. Next video, maybe more horror, maybe more RPG. We'll see.